The meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council Ordinance Committee of January 26th. And I have five speaker slips, and I'd appreciate getting those in right away because we don't want to get caught unawares. My expectation would be to have this meeting go till no later than 1:45, and then if we are not able to conclude our business at that time, we would continue it to another date. So with that, Ms. Peterson, would you like to guide us on how we go forward?
I believe Danny Cato will be making a staff presentation today on Danny Cato is the staff who will be making the presentation on today's item.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Cato?
Thank you, Chair White. Welcome to the new members and old. My name is Danny Cato. I'm a senior planner with the Planning Division. I have been working very hard at this with Steve Wiley, City Attorney's Office, and Captain Armando Martel from the Police Department to try to revise the ordinance, to get a revision to the ordinance somehow adopted. So since two of you are new to this, one really new, Chair White, I gave a presentation about this to the Planning Commission on December 17th. You were there for that. It's going to be kind of a recap of that. Councilmember House has been here through the whole thing, so this will be quite a recap. So I'll try to go through this fairly quickly because there are some outstanding issues that we want to get to. A little bit of history. In August 2007, this whole process for the medical marijuana dispensary started as a result of community input. There was, in fact, one dispensary in particular that was causing a lot of problems, and the Westside Community Group approached council, and council decided to implement to start a process to get a ordinance to regulate these dispensaries. In March 2008, the Medical Cannabis Dispensary Ordinance, or MCD ordinance that I have up there, was adopted. And after that, we started actually, it took a while before we got applications going, but in about the fall and winter of 2008, we started to get quite a number of dispensaries applications in. As a result of those dispensaries coming through and the community concern about them, Council on July 28th of 2009 started a process to revise the ordinance to tighten it up. From September to November of 2009, the Ordinance Committee met 5 or 6 times to hash through these issues and made some initial recommendations. And then on a parallel track, on early December, the Council adopted a 45-day suspension of the current medical cannabis dispensary ordinance. That was introduced on the 7th and adopted on the 15th. It runs for 45 days, which is the end of this week. On today's council agenda, there is the item to extend that. And on December 17th, Now, whenever there are zoning ordinance amendments, there's a requirement of state law that Planning Commission make a recommendation to council. We went to Planning Commission on December 17th to get those recommendations, and I'll be presenting those a little bit later in my presentation. So that's a brief history of the last 2.5 years or so. The current ordinance has locational and operational restrictions. For locational, they're allowed in the C2 and CM zones, which are general commercial C2 and commercial manufacturing CM zones. They are, in addition to that, they're allowed any place on Outer State Street from Kylerellis to the city limit line, or Kyreal, on Milpas and on Cliff Drive, within 1,000 feet of MEGs. They are prohibited within 500 feet of schools, parks, and other dispensaries, and also prohibited on State Street between Highway 101 and Arriaga Streets. There's some maps up here that kind of give you an indication. This is citywide. Those are the 4 areas that I discussed: Outer State, downtown, Milpas, and the Mesa. This is the downtown area. The pinkish is where the dispensaries are allowed. The green areas show parks, blue show schools, and then there's some light green and light blue, which show 500 feet radii from those schools and parks. This is the outer State Street area. This is the Milpas area. And on Milpas, there are a couple of dispensaries that are, actually, these are both now approved and operating. This one is 331 North Milpas. That's 500 North Milpas. 500 North Milpas opened on January 5th, and they are open and operating now. And here's the Mesa. Here's Cliff and Meg's. So this is the Mesa Shopping Center. There are a whole bunch of operating restrictions in the current ordinance, running from criminal history to security requirements to what you can sell there, all kinds of requirements that I'm not going to go into. Now, the ordinance committee direction was...
Dr. Lee, hang on a sec. Would everybody please check their cell phones and just turn them off, please? Thank you. Or silence them anyway.
All right, I'll do the same. Okay, so the ordinance committee made recommendations. The first one was there would be a cap on the number of dispensaries, and that number was recommended to be 7 in 7 geographical areas. Those areas being Outer State, Delavina, Mission, Downtown West, Downtown East, Milpas, and the Mesa. Other direction was to give more discretion to the staff hearing officer and the planning commission by changing the approval criteria. A prohibition on dispensaries in existing mixed-use buildings with residential condos, but allow non-conforming dispensaries to exist without an amortization period. An annual review by the police department and the staff hearing officer. Increased security requirements. There are security requirements that we put on as, well, there's a security guard requirement in the current ordinance. The way it's implemented now through the staff hearing officer is that we require state license, and one of the ordinance committee members and the ordinance committee in November agreed that it should be the most stringent type of licensing possible for these security guards. A proximity prohibition 1,000 feet from Casa Esperanza, the homeless shelter down on Cacique Street, and 1,000 feet from other dispensaries, and reducing the amortization period for existing non-conforming dispensaries to 6 months. And we haven't nailed down exactly when that would start. So that's one of the outstanding issues for today. The appeals would continue to stop at the Planning Commission. The current ordinance does not allow appeal from Planning Commission to City Council. The Ordinance Committee's recommendation was to continue. Not to expand the areas allowed to the Cottage Hospital area or Coast Village Road. They didn't want to increase the uses around which those prohibitions are drawn, so keep it at 500 feet from schools and parks. They recommended a discussion of dispensaries versus collectives, and the City Council pretty much agreed to that in a different meeting, and we're calling that the Phase 2 discussions, the collective model versus the dispensary model. And then there are some minor miscellaneous changes to the ordinance language. And the Ordinance Committee asked the Planning Commission to make further recommendations on locations, because that hadn't been quite locked down by the Ordinance Committee. We kept seeming to run out of time for that. A quick list of the approved and pending dispensaries here. There are 2, like I said, that are approved and operating, 331 North Milpas and 500 North Milpas. There's one that is approved. It has a building permit issued. It's under construction. That is at 631 Olive Street. There are 2 that have been approved by the staff hearing officer but have been appealed to Planning Commission, and those are being held in abeyance while the suspension is in effect. There was 1 that was revoked at 2 West Mission, and there are 6 that are pending. There are 4 non-conforming dispensaries. These are dispensaries that existed prior to August of 2007 when this whole process started. Now, 3 of those are actually under cease and desist orders from the city attorney's office through enforcement actions. And that would be the first 3 on this list here, Orta Farms, Sacred Mountain, and AMG. And there are several that are illegal or under dispute. 2 of those have actually confirmed closed. Now, when the Planning Commission reviewed this on December 17th. They looked at it and had their own recommendations, and here they are. The first is a maximum number of dispensaries between 2 and 4, depending on who you talk to on the commission, but they were uniformly less than 7. A recommendation to reduce the maximum number of geographic areas to 4 or fewer, to expand the list of protected uses to include all alcohol and drug rehab facilities, not just Casa Esperanza, to include youth-oriented institutions, and in fact, all uses protected by the Adult Entertainment Ordinance, daycares, religious institutions, preschools. The list is quite extensive and attached to the council agenda report that you have. They also recommended increasing the protection radii to 1,000 feet from 500 from all those different uses to allow them in Cottage Hospital area, since this is a medical use and they thought it would be most appropriate around the medical office zones. And then to allow appeals to City Council. The Planning Commission didn't make recommendations on locations. They felt it was premature, because there seemed to be further to go on the basic parameters of the ordinance. So we don't have final recommendations from the Planning Commission on location other than the Cottage Hospital and the radii and those protected uses. Now, there are a number of outstanding issues. Ordinance Committee said 7. Planning Commission said 2 to 4. Number of geographic areas allowed. How the amortization period for existing non-conforming dispensaries would work, actually when it would start, and just making sure we understand how the amortization period would work for permitted dispensaries that are permitted under the current ordinance but would become non-conforming to the new requirements, allowable locations, and the next steps. So number of dispensaries, like I said, Ordinance Committee recommended 7, Planning Commission recommended 2 to 4. Now the reason that, at least my understanding of the reason the Ordinance Committee recommended 7 and they wanted to keep that number a little bit higher than the Planning Commission was because with dispensaries in storefront locations, we would have zoning ordinance that would control them, and they could be regulated, and we could monitor them. You know, there's a 1 year check-in period, every annual check-in period, et cetera. And that was a way of keeping the trade, I guess, above board to a great extent. Because without storefronts, and the state law does allow collectives without storefronts, in fact, most people would say that it requires them. Without the storefronts, the whole thing could just go underground and into the neighborhoods, and that could be what's intended by the state laws. But it also makes it difficult for city staff, the police department, and us in zoning to keep tabs on it. So I think that was, I hope Councilmember House agrees, that seemed to be the impetus behind keeping the number a little bit higher than it could be. You know, we had a lot of public comment from people saying, well, the city of Oakland, a city of 300,000 or 400,000 people, only have 4. Why do we need 7? But I think it really was to keep it out in the open.
Mr. Chair, if I may. Mr. Kato, and you can confirm my memory is not all that good, but I do my best. That was a very important part of our conversation, what you just mentioned. Another one had to do with a concern about having whatever impacts there might be all be in one or a few neighborhoods, and the distribution throughout the city would possibly reduce that. And the third piece was for those who are what I think people would understand as genuinely in need, having these be relatively convenient and not some faraway land on the other side of town or something. That was the third piece. Those are the 3 pieces of rationale that were in our discussion.
Thank you. So this is one of the outstanding issues. What should the number be? The final recommendation to council? Question mark. Next, for existing non-conforming dispensaries, and these are the 4 that pre-existed the current ordinance. Both the Ordinance Committee and the Planning Commission thought 6 months was good, we as staff don't quite know when that should start. There are all kinds of places where it could start. It could be retroactive to some period in the past. It could be upon adoption of this ordinance. Yeah. So we just want to get that nailed down for the recommendation to council. And we have had public comment asking, is 6 months enough given the upcoming Phase 2 discussions? The concern from the public was, if there are these dispensaries that are required to close in 6 months before the new, all the new requirements are in place, that at least that may not be fair. So we just want to, for one of the final things for the ordinance committee, hopefully, is to nail down when that, how long the period should be. 6 months so far seems good, but when it would start. And we just wanted to confirm an ordinance committee recommendation for the newly created non-conforming dispensaries. These would be the ones that have gone through our process, our current process, and they are open and operating. And what will happen to these ones? And as I understood it, the last ordinance committee meeting, the location, they would be able to remain there indefinitely. I mean, unless there was a change of ownership or something like that. But they would have to come back in within 6 months to update their permits to make them conform to the newly adopted regulations. I think that's what was intended by the ordinance committee. I want to make sure that that's right. And then allowable locations. This could take a lot of time or not. It sort of depends. There are a couple of items that I want to go over in specific. And I have some maps that are attached. There's a possibility of hooking into the GIS, Geographic Information System, on my desk to try to fool around with this stuff. It just will depend a lot on how much time we have. There are a couple of spots that I did want to highlight. And we'll start on Outer State Street. So this is the Outer State Street area. What we show in the terracotta, and terracotta underlays all this, is where the current ordinance allows dispensaries in this area. What the purple stripes show, that's crosshatch, is as written in the ordinance that's attached to your packet. This is what would be allowed in the Upper State Street area. So it excludes a lot of the La Cumbre Plaza area and a little bit of 5 Points. These two parcels in particular I wanted to highlight because the way that the current ordinance is written, it says you're allowed to have these dispensaries in the C2 zone and if you front on State Street. These particular, so all these, there's a combination of C2 and CP and RO zoning up in this area along State Street. These two are zone CP, which the ordinance wouldn't normally allow them. They don't have frontage on State Street, even though, because they're 1 block away. This is the old Magnolia 2 Cleaners, which is just down from where Pete's Coffee is, if you're familiar with that area. And so it's sort of an artifact of the way that the ordinance was written. We think as staff that these should be included. As you can see, this is an area it seems ideal. It's far away from schools and parks, and actually there is an application that one of the operators has put in for this location. We think it's a good one, and so we would like that to be added into the locations. That's one specific recommendation. We also wanted we asked the Planning Commission to do this too, but they didn't. We wanted to have a conversation about what about these areas that are currently allowed but wouldn't be allowed in the ordinance as written. So that's kind of a lot of that in this area, the La Cumbre Plaza. This is the De La Vina area, and as you can see, there's a few areas where the current ordinance allows them, where the proposed ordinance language doesn't allow them. But there's also one, this is the Ralph's Shopping Center, where the ordinance language as currently proposed would allow them, where the existing ordinance doesn't. This is the Mission Street area. Here, this is State and Mission. And again, the current ordinance allows the entire terracotta area. As written, the proposal would allow it only on these 2 blocks of Mission Street. This is It's a school. It was a use that was determined to be a school by the Planning Commission at 16 East Mission Street. So this shows a 500-foot radius around that. So, a question is what to do about these. And the downtown east and west, the last ordinance committee meeting, I had split the city at State Street, but the ordinance committee decided that it should actually be moved over to around Santa Barbara Street. So I'm showing that here. That would give a little bit more allowable areas in this box versus the east side, which is this box over here. And again, there are a lot of areas where they're currently allowed and may be appropriate, like on this part of Carrillo Street, where, so we want to get some input for that and lock down the locations. Milpas, there's not a whole lot of difference in between what's currently allowed and what is proposed, or the way it's written. The one big change was the 1,000 feet from Casa Esperanza, which is right here. Here's the freeway, and this is Milpas. But there isn't a whole lot of change here. And then no change on the Mesa. So like I said, if we have time and I can get the technology to work, those maps are kind of on a computer program that I can turn layers on and off. I have different radii from parks and schools and all that kind of stuff that we could play with if you want. But another thing that we wanted to try and do was to change the way that the methodology for determining where dispensaries are allowed. Right now, we say there's a big area that's allowed, the C2 and CM zones, and then outer station and what have you. And then we start chipping away at that by putting in protected uses and then drawing these circles around the protected uses. And we're hoping to get away from that to the greatest extent possible, and instead say, well, we think they should be allowed on the 3,000 to 3,700 blocks of State Street, period. They should be allowed on the 11 or 1,200 block of Chapala Street, whatever it is, to the greatest extent possible. We think it'd be easier to do that than to have all these different radii especially from uses that can change from time to time, like daycares can open and close. Same with preschools, churches, that sort of thing. Well, churches are a little bit more permanent, but that sort of thing would be easier for us, and I think more user-friendly to be able to say, this block, you're good. So we're hoping to try to get to that sort of paradigm. So staff recommendations are to review the Planning Commission's recommendations, finalize those outstanding issues, the maximum number of dispensaries and their geographic locations, the amortization period for existing nonconforming, the amortization period for the newly nonconforming, the appeal process, and the locations and the next steps. Now, in this, I didn't make a slide of this actually. In the staff report, I described two possible next steps, and there could be many others. But one is just to wrap up at the Ordinance Committee and make final recommendations and put it on the agenda for introduction and subsequent adoption, and then carry on with the Phase 2 discussions after that. Another possibility is to kind of come up with the final recommendations, put Phase 1 on hold, start Phase 2, and then do the whole thing in one fell swoop. There is an option for that, and that is to allow or have the amortization period for the non-conforming dispensaries go forward on itself. Anyway, that's an option for discussion. I think without any specific direction to the contrary, we would just continue with these discussions, get the final recommendations going, and then schedule it for introduction at council. That concludes my recommendation. And then, also, final recommendation is to make recommendation to council on this ordinance. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Cato. Are there questions to Mr. Cato? Mr. Hotchkiss?
I'm the newbie here, so explain just briefly Phase 1 and Phase 2, the difference.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
Phase 1 are the revisions that are in front of you. This is the stuff that the Ordinance Committee has been working on since September. And it is primarily locational and operational changes to the ordinance. Phase 2 is a broader discussion, really. State law has some requirements for the distribution of medical cannabis. And state law requires that it be, well, it primarily says you should grow your own, and it allows you to grow your own. But a lot of people aren't able to do that physically, so it allows the formation of collectives and cooperatives, which are groups of people who would come together and collectively farm and distribute among themselves. And the dispensary doesn't really fit into that model, even though it's the model that a lot of jurisdictions have been using. But it seems like there's sentiment to change that, and definitely there was sentiment on the council, in fact, direction from council, to look into making sure, ways to make sure that medical cannabis distribution in the city conforms with state laws on collectives. And so that's a broader discussion that is what that's what we're calling phase 2.
Mr. House?
Just a couple of questions. One, we didn't, since it's been so long ago that we went over some of these things, remembering back to that one dispensary that gave us such heartburn and got us into this conversation. Would you just take a minute and talk about what can happen on the premises of whatever it's called, a dispensary or collective with a storefront, whatever? Can there be entertainment? Can it be a nightclub or a cafe, or could it be kind of a bar scene but around marijuana? What are we talking about here, just fundamentally?
Chair White, Councilmember House, thank you for asking that question. The purpose of the ordinance and the way that the ordinance is written, our City of Santa Barbara ordinance, the dispensary it's really more like a high security pharmacy. It's not a place of congregation. It's a place where patients are supposed to come, show their paperwork, get advised on the type of cannabis that might help their health situation, purchase it, I guess, and then leave and go home. It's not a place for hanging out. There's no cafe allowed. There's no retail sales of paraphernalia like smoking pipes and like that, not allowed. They are allowed to have ancillary services like massage or acupuncture, or be able to set those services up. They can even sell other supplements, right? But that's it. It's definitely not a place of congregation. I mean, that was part of the reason that this whole ordinance got started, was because some of these dispensaries, they were more like smoking clubs. People would just come in and spend all day there, and smoke coming out the doors, and all that sort of thing. And the council definitely wanted to put a stop to that sort of behavior, because that is behavior that is detrimental to the surrounding neighborhoods. So the purpose of the ordinance that we have in place now, and which would be further revised if that happens, is to really control the behavior of the dispensary operators and their patients. There are requirements that say that you can't consume cannabis within 200 feet of the dispensary. The dispensaries are supposed to have security guards or personnel who roam around and make sure there's no graffiti, and they make sure that their patients aren't, kind of back in a corner, choking up, et cetera. So it's very controlled the way it is, and these revisions would tighten it up even more.
Thank you. To the point that you had raised a minute ago, and we're answering this question about this phase 1 or phase 2 conversation, one of the concerns I think all of us have had along the way is that state laws continuing to change and, going through different challenges and this kind of thing. One of the things that has been a real concern for me, and I'd like to just verify that you see it there, in the current, actually, let's just speak to the revised ordinance, there's clear language that directly ties any permitted dispensary or collective with a storefront, directly ties them to state law. In other words, if they are breaking state law, they can lose their license. And we've hooked it to state law without defining what the state law is, because we know it's going through whatever changes it might go through. We've made that connection. Is that accurate?
Chair White, Councilmember House, yes, that is right. The our ordinance implements state law, and there's plenty of language in there that points you back to state law. As you said, state law is changing, and if dispensaries don't follow state law, they are subject not just to lose their permit from us, their land use permit, but they're subject to criminal prosecution, actually. You know, that the police department, one of their jobs is to make sure that they're doing what they're saying they're supposed to be doing. And if they're not, they can be shut down, and not only shut down, but criminally prosecuted. The one that I'm thinking of was just in the news, 715 Bond Street. That was a illegal dispensary. It wasn't non-conforming. It was just completely illegal, and they did an investigation and found them to be illegal, and now they're undergoing criminal prosecution. So, yes.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Cato.
Can you give us a little, what information you might have on the collectives, the sort of the non-storefront distribution of cannabis at this point? Is there any knowledge, or there doesn't seem to be any tracking system? Is there a tracking system for that?
No, there isn't. Not that I've ever heard of. I mean, that's something through the phase 2 discussions the city might want to implement. You know, if you're going to have a collective, you have to register with the city, but there isn't anything like that right now, and there's no state requirement that any collective register with the state. It's just, right now, it just seems to be any random group of people could get together and form a collective.
And to Mr. Wiley, does the city have any ability to require that, or is that does the city have the ability to require that?
Mr. Chair, we may. The only city that I know of that's even seriously considered this is the city of Los Angeles. They were drafting what I would call a phase 2 ordinance, and that was an ordinance that recognized that state law allowed collectives and cooperatives. And the ordinance was not a zoning ordinance. It was really more of a police powers ordinance, and was to be enforced by the police department and the city finance department. And it had things like that. For example, the collective cooperative would have to be formed at a certain date, and the records on that formation would have to be provided to the city and updated on a regular basis. And the cultivation of the marijuana would have to be explained, who and how the marijuana was being cultivated, because the state law does not allow the illegal purchase of marijuana. It does provide for cooperative collective cultivation of marijuana. But that ordinance went through a fairly long process in the city of Los Angeles, and ultimately the city council declined to go that route, and just recently adopted what I would call the zoning model. They're back regulating storefront dispensaries, like we've been discussing. But, the goal here, to answer your question maybe more specifically, state law is preemptive. In fact, there was just a recent decision by a court of appeal that said the what do we call it? The Compassionate Use Act, the initiative from 1996, was controlling over state law, and that even the state and cities cannot do anything contrary to the Compassionate Use Act. But the state statutes that were adopted to implement the Compassionate Use Act are controlling. They expressly say that they can be supplemented by city regulations. So the exact question is, could we, in supplementing those state laws, require cooperatives to register with the city and provide the city with their patient records? And I think the conclusion is it may be possible. We would probably want to respect the confidentiality of those records and only use them for law enforcement purposes. But I think it may be possible. As we all know, this is an evolving thing, and there's a lot of appeal cases right now at the Court of Appeal level kind of fleshing out the state law. So. Thank you.
And my last question would be to Captain Martell, would be the what is the enforcement, what is law enforcement seeing as the profile of managing marijuana in this city at this time? Are we finding that we're We're seeing a lot of collective marijuana around the place. Is there any enforcement going on at all in the marijuana area? Where are we with regards to enforcement of inappropriate use of marijuana at this point? Whatever that might be. Illegal use, I guess, would be the way to put it.
Chair and committee members, as you're well aware of, that there's been two illegal dispensaries shut down probably in the last 6 months. The last one was in Bond, and then there was another one that sprung up in the east side of town. So there are plenty to go around for enforcement, for law enforcement to keep an eye on. As I mentioned before in several other venues, that we are paying attention. We are paying attention to the criminal element in this area in our community. We are paying attention to, the ever-changing laws and the court cases coming down, which provide case law for us, so we can take some action or refinement of the existing laws. So we are paying attention, and we're here and working with our partners in community development, the city attorney, and you as leaders to make decisions here in regards to what we need to do in regards to the dispensaries that are going to be here in our community. So we are paying attention. We are looking at you for direction as well. So it's kind of a tightrope that law enforcement rides, and it's not just in our community. It's throughout the state and throughout our country. But the reality is that we are paying attention. We do take enforcement action. We did on 2 dispensaries. We also talk to the existing dispensaries and try to work with them to answer any of their questions or issues that are arising. But there are plenty of other issues surrounding the illegal sales of marijuana that we also look into. But I prefer not to use this venue to discuss it, because we have officers that are constantly investigating those type of things. But I think the best answer to you is that we are paying attention as a law enforcement agency.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Hi, officer. Have you seen any particular criminal activity around the existing dispensaries, whether they're conforming or not? In other words, are these drawing any negative activity?
I would say that maybe not around the dispensaries, but in the dispensaries, there's been several cases, and I think I cited them before, where there's been issues within the dispensaries. We had one on Parker Way where we did an investigation and arrest, where there was an extortion and some violence that occurred there. We also did an investigation on the one on Bond, where there was some act of violence there as well. We've had some prior cases where there was actual robberies in and around the dispensary where people were leaving the dispensary. I think that was in 2007. We had a couple issues with that. They're also victimized, and I don't hold this against the dispensaries for calling us and reporting this. They've also been victims of burglaries, the break-ins, and those type of things. But again, it's a fact of life that when you have a business where the product is valued, there's potential for criminal activity.
Mr. House?
Yeah, just a question here. Mr. Cato, the Attorney General, one of the distinctions I think is critically important here. The Attorney General made produced some guidelines that would help us a little bit with some of this stuff. And one of the issues was whether a cooperative or a collaborative could also be a storefront. I mean, storefront meaning that it's on a retail street, that it has a front door and people can come in it, as opposed to being in a residence like an apartment house or something like that. And it's my understanding from my reading was that he was pretty clear that just being a cooperative or collective did not mean that you couldn't have a front door on a main street and have a storefront. Am I correct in that? It's kind of an important distinction, I think, because this is the realm we're in right now.
Chair White, Councilmember House, I read it the same way. I think the pretty close to exact words is that storefront collectives may be lawful or may be allowable under the act. It wasn't positive either way, because, and I think the reason is because the way that the state law is written, there's not supposed to be any profit being made, right? I mean, not just a non-profit corporation, but in this collective model that we know is allowed by the state law, you're really only supposed to be getting reimbursed for your actual costs of cultivating the marijuana. You know, the whole thing, the collective, everybody puts in their work and they get their share. You know, that's sort of what it's supposed to be about. And then when you add in rent and employees and all that stuff, it gets dicey. And I don't think, although the Attorney General didn't say they were absolutely illegal, it sure made it sound like it would be a pretty high bar to be legal. That was my reading of it, and maybe Mr. Wiley has more to add on that.
Mr. Chair, I agree. The real question is, does the state law permit a retail transaction for marijuana? And it doesn't appear, if you read the laws closely, that it does. That I've said this before. To me, it helps understand what the state law, I think, would clearly allow. State law would clearly allow a group of individuals to come together, maybe even in writing, form a cooperative. Let's say 10 individuals, and a cooperative is actually an official form of legal entity, official legal entity that you register with the state, much like a corporation. So 10 individuals could form a cooperative, register with the Secretary of State's office, and say, we are a medical marijuana cooperative, and among ourselves we've got qualified patients and we've got primary caregivers. Those are two terms used by state law, and they're pretty clearly defined. And among ourselves, we're going to cultivate marijuana and distribute it to the qualified patients. And the state law clearly allows the expenses of that cultivation and distribution to be shared. That doesn't mean that someone could form a nonprofit corporation and pay someone a large salary. That sharing expenses is not paying someone a salary. There's a distinction. But anyway, if 10 individuals got together and collectively cultivated marijuana, and then once a month had a potluck, no pun intended, and distributed the marijuana to the people who needed it, and then in the distribution they said, your share of our expenses this month for electricity and for water and fertilizer, it's $50. If the police caught wind of that and investigated, I think the police would say, that's allowed by state law. So the question becomes, can those same individuals, instead of having a get-together, can they just have a storefront where the same people could walk in the storefront and say, I'm here to pick up my marijuana and to reimburse you for your expenses, to my share of the expenses? And I think that's what the Attorney General was referring to in the guidelines. And that's all the Attorney General was referring to, as opposed to what you see in these dispensaries, in a lot of these dispensaries. A person that is not a member of any cooperative may have a note from a doctor saying they should be using medical marijuana, or could be, or even an ID card from the county. They walk in and it's essentially a retail over-the-counter transaction. And I think personally in the long run the courts are going to say that retail transaction, that storefront thing, is not allowed by state law. And that's really the essence of our Phase 2 discussion. There are quite a few cities that have banned dispensaries altogether, and the courts have allowed that. There are a few cities that attempt to regulate dispensaries: West Hollywood, Oakland, San Francisco, now Los Angeles. And we're still working through this regulating dispensaries, storefront dispensaries, but telling them nothing we're doing allows you to violate state law. So.
Great, thank you.
All right, I'd like to open the public comment period. I've got 16 speakers, and if we were to give ourselves a half hour, then we would be at 2 minutes apiece. So I'll start with Hathor Hammett, to be followed by Derek Weston. It's on.
No, it should be green.
Should be green.
Good afternoon. My name is Hawther Hammett. I've been a patient of the Compassion Center for 8 years. It is the only dispensary I have ever used. I'm here to put a human face on this, I guess. We all want dispensaries regulated. My fear is that the Compassion Center, who has been doing everything it can at great expense to meet all the requirements, will be lumped in with those fly-by-night places who are not. First, security there is very tight. I have to go through the same security measures as anyone, even though the staff knows me. It is located in a very discreet building, no sign, no advertising. I appreciate this because I value my privacy. It's not near any schools or places where children congregate. The staff is professional and consistent. As far as I know, it is the only one with registered nurses on the staff. And finally, I'm treated with dignity there. And this is about safe access to the only medication that works for me. All we really want is fairness and compassion. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you.
Let me ask a question just for a second. We haven't had many people come who've actually used these. Ms. Hammett, my concern is one that was raised a minute ago, and that has to do with the safety for you as a patient.
Yes.
What's been your experience going to this, wherever it was that you're going?
I'm a patient at the Compassion Center on De La Vina, which is in the process now of trying to comply with all the regulations. My experience is when I go in, first of all, you cannot tell what kind of business it is from the outside, all right? You walk in and there's a lobby. I have to go through the lobby before I can go to the security window where I put my ID through, and then I must be buzzed in, okay? And when I go in, the door is locked behind me. The room that I'm in where I purchase my medication, that's the only thing they do there, and their computers and things. The room where the medication is kept and put together, prepared, is a completely locked, separate room. I cannot even see that room. Okay? So it is, when I go in there, there's never more than 1 or 2 patients in there. I know the staff. I feel it's not, it's just so discreet. I feel like no one knows why I'm going in there, so they would certainly not bother me. And I just feel really safe getting my medication there. And I don't get gouged. Okay? These people are not in it for the money, believe me. They're, so I get my medication. I feel safe. I go home.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Hi, thank you for coming. How long have you been using medical marijuana?
Approximately 10 years.
And before that, what were your symptoms and how have they changed as a result of using it?
Okay, well...
you don't have to be elaborate. Just
Oh, thank you. Actually, I do have a serious medical condition. I have arthritis and fibromyalgia. There are times I need to walk with a cane. Other times, like right now, I just have a limp. Before, I had to take medication that had horrendous side effects. One of them, the last one I tried, made me want to commit suicide. I am not a depressed kind of person. I'm a very functioning person, active in my community. I am very, very functioning, law-abiding person. So I had to try to take these medications because I could not function. I could not get out of bed, and I couldn't work. So now I'm on disability, but I have medication that is helping me, and I'm very satisfied.
Thank you. Mr. Weston?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Welcome to the 2 new members of the Council and the Ordinance Committee. My name is Derek Weston, and I'm here on behalf of Santa Barbara Patients Group, which has an existing dispensary at 3128 State Street. It operates, and this is important, as a nonprofit. It operates as a collective. All of the members sign a member agreement. And the Santa Barbara Patients Group is very strict about enforcing it. We believe that if all of the dispensaries were operated like this one, that the city would not have a problem. We're very proud of the way they operate. Very, very, very strict. You should read the entire current ordinance. It is actually extremely strict. But because it has not been fully enforced, not all of the dispensaries in town comply. So the problem that Santa Barbara Patients Group faces is that it is, as the crow flies, closer than 500 feet to Mackenzie Park. So it must relocate. It's happy to do that. We're trying to navigate this process so it can do so without going out of business, which is important from the moratorium perspective. So we fully support very strict regulation of lawful distribution of medical cannabis, and think your current ordinance, along with the amendments you're proposing, is excellent. We do think that the distinction between dispensary and collective sometimes gets confusing, and I think it was a little bit even confusing today. We think the dispensary model is very good for the city because it gives a location to the service and allows you to adopt a very strict ordinance and regulate it. If there are no dispensaries, I don't think there's a model to regulate it, and we don't think that's in the city's or the public's interest. The 2 points I want to emphasize today is that we do hope you will include that little white rectangle.
About 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry, the white rectangle on La Cumbra. That's important because it's a lawful location. And we think it's important when you address the moratorium that you do so not in isolation, but in the context of what will businesses do that are lawful now or are non-conforming to make sure that they will be able, in a reasonable time frame, to comply.
Thank you. Thank you. Heather Poet to be followed by Naomi Green.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I represent the Dispensary Dispensing Collective, Santa Barbara Patients Group, and I'm here to address 2 issues that are imperative to our patients and the community at large. Without adoption of an ordinance in a timely fashion, the Ordinance Committee and Council have little to no control over sensible regulation. This is not what our community needs. Santa Barbara Patients Group has an 8-year proven track record for being responsibly run. We currently reside on Upper State Street, and as Heather Hammett also addressed, our collective is very, very similar to theirs. Our patients say all of the same things. What she explained to you is how responsibly run dispensing collectives work. The patients do need to be let in, and they do need to, no matter how long we've known them, 8 years, a couple of months, need to go through the same process, the same restrictive process to come in. There are no children or random people coming into these places in responsibly run collectives. We do not comply with the current locational requirements, but we do comply with the operational requirements of the current ordinance. Our suggestion is that you adopt the Phase 1 revisions.
30 seconds.
Thank you. And not spend too long on the potentially ambiguous issues in the Phase 2 revisions, because they are addressed in what you have currently now, which is to say the current ordinance reflects state law. Let state law do what it needs to do, and you will find that you'll have what you need and the community needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi Green to be followed by Patrick Formey.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I was involved with this from the beginning because as an East Side resident, I voiced concerns, and there were widespread concerns that the East Side was being unduly burdened with the dispensaries. And so I welcome the notion that there would be a set number in the city and that they would be in different locations. But I'm still concerned about the East Side because it's very unclear what would happen to the non-conforming ones on the East Side. So in other words, right now I think there are 2 legal ones, one pending on the East Side and several non-conforming. So So if, say, there's one allowed in that location, does that mean that the others become nonconforming? And if they become nonconforming, what happens to them? Do they exist indefinitely? Or is there some mechanism whereby you determine which one should represent the east side? So I think that when you're so I just urge you, when you're redoing the ordinance, to pay really very scrupulous attention to that issue, which is of the fate of the legal, I don't know what you would call it, legal nonconforming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Just again, so that the east side doesn't bear more than its share of.
Thank you.
Mr. Cato could give us just a very quick answer, because we did deal with that. I think there were three in particular that are of interest, and there was an attrition factor, Mr. Cato.
Can we let's hold our comments. We'll have please address that. But that's a good point.
We need to come back to that. It's very important.
So, Mr. Formey, followed by Sharon Byrne.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. I know this has been a long and arduous task, and now you've inherited more discussion, and you have to wade through this. I just wanted to mention a few items briefly, and one was the idea of what would be applicable for a permit process. And what I'm seeing potentially missing from the staff report and the summation of the ordinance committee's suggestions were the following. One, I think it's important that the dispensary or collective model present non-profit filings with either the state or the federal government to coincide with the Attorney General's guidelines. Also, I think it's important that and it's easily done, to change the nomenclature of dispensary to collectives, because if a person is entering a collective or dispensary and is part of a collective, the basic language of it being a collective versus dispensary would satiate the Attorney General's guidelines. Three, I noticed in the summation of the Ordinance Committee's recommendation, one of the key factors was addressing the cannabis emerging onto campuses. And what I thought we had in there at one point was the idea that if a collective knowingly was reselling, one of the patients was knowingly reselling the cannabis, and that particular collective, and all collectives in general, will put on notice.
30 seconds.
And they continued to sell cannabis to that person, that they would be in jeopardy and of losing their permit. And I didn't see that in the recent paperwork. Also, there's a measure to tax the collectives that potentially could come to the city, and it's important to have a tax and tolerate model ready to go in the city, and the rest will take more than 30 seconds, so I'll go ahead and just wrap up with one last thing, is that we had, last week we had a gentleman come in and their mother, and a doctor at Sampson Clinic had prescribed everything from Prozac to Lunesta to Buspar to Amphotericin to Lasix.
Okay, you're going to need to wrap up here.
Okay. And it just gives you, really, the point I'm trying to make here is that who are we to say that that a patient should really be lined up at CVS for these types of drugs when and they're all corporate-based large pharmaceutical companies, when they could be receiving some sort of natural medication, and it's really the choice of and the liberty of the person to be doing that. And the rest we can talk about later.
Thank you. Sharon Byrne, to be followed by Tony Vasallo.
Good afternoon, Chair White, Councilmember House, Hotchkiss, and House. I just want to make a couple of points. Coming from the East Side Franklin Center Advisory Committee, and also from the West Downtown neighborhood, I'm looking a lot at that swath of downtown that currently is very populated with recovery facilities, schools, and sensitive use areas. And I read in the staff report that there's a recommendation that if you go and adopt an 1,000-foot radii for all special use facilities and not allow dispensaries in that area, that would effectively wipe out that swath of downtown for use. I think that might not be a bad thing. That if that part of the city has already been decided, I guess by previous councils, to host those kind of special needs facilities, it might not be conducive to mix and mingle them with dispensaries, which leads us to what I think is kind of a strange exercise in trying to figure out where do we put something called a dispensary that, as Mr. Wiley pointed out, state courts seem to be increasingly leaning towards saying probably aren't legal. And then we are looking at a collective and a cooperative model. And as Mr. Welly points out, a collective model is much more communal than what you see in the typical dispensaries. One of the things I would invite you to do as the Ordinance Committee is perhaps interview some of the dispensaries that talk before you and ask them to explain their model to you, where they cultivate their marijuana, what's the average patient donation, so you'd get an understanding of how their collective works and whether or not it truly conforms to state law. Thank you.
I have a question for you. Are you on the Franklin Neighborhood Advisory Committee?
I am.
And is that meeting now?
It actually met last Wednesday at 7 p.m. So yes, the meetings have started up.
Okay. And has that been meeting regularly?
They meet every month, third Wednesday of every month.
Third Wednesday of every month. Thank you very much. Mr. Vasallo,
I'm Tony Vasallo.
to be followed by
Brinkerhoff resident. And
somebody rather. I can't read the writing. We'll get to that.
I've really cut this down to the bare bones, so I'll just throw out some points. I think your committee and the city should get out of the business of dispensaries altogether and throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's a matter that should be turned over to the county health department, and I think it's only something like the county health department that it can address the wide range of issues that encompass all the problems associated with dispensaries in our county. We don't want to be L.A. They'll never be able to put the toothpaste back in the tube in L.A. With the problems they're facing. And any distribution model, marijuana distribution model, without constant oversight by proper authority, it's simply doomed to illegal profiteering and failure. The county's probably the best position with their health department to address the needs and the current situation with coming down with all of the state court decisions. I've submitted a letter from the Brinkerhoff District again, asking that a simple change be made if you go forward with your ordinance to please include us on the list of areas within the city where dispensaries are not permitted, because one dispensary will ruin our district. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vasallo. So I'm sorry I can't read Steve's last name. Rifkin. Sorry about that. And then Joanna LaForce is next.
Thank you. My name is Steve Rifkin. I've been a resident and voter and registered voter in the city of Santa Barbara for the past 10 years in Santa Barbara County since 1986. I'm also a licensed California physician, and I write letters of recommendation to patients who qualify. I'm also a member of the California State Bar and an actively practicing law right here in Santa Barbara. So I've made it a point to understand the medical, scientific aspects of medicinal marijuana as well as the legal aspects, and I believe I understand them both pretty well. What I find kind of disturbing about a lot of this discussion, especially the last speaker, was that there seems to be a reaction to unfounded charges relating to the dispensaries, collectives, whatever you wish to call them. I even recall Sheriff Brown, as reported in the Daily Sound, saying that these places attracted criminals in the form of extortionists, armed robbers, and rapists. And there's absolutely no statistic anywhere to back this up. Nothing backs this up whatsoever. It's a myth. It's fear-mongering. And what I fear is that this is what the city council is responding to, is a great deal of fear-mongering regarding these things. There's been a ton of discussion about proximity to schools. And yet Mr. Cotto very nicely pointed out that these dispensaries, in his own words, were very high security pharmacies, much higher security than any other pharmacy, much higher security than liquor stores. It takes quite a bit to get through the door, as has already been explained, including a phone call to me verifying that the patient is actually a qualified patient. These aren't things that are done at liquor stores. These aren't
30 seconds.
These aren't done anywhere else. So I find this whole issue about proximity to the special use areas, again, response to fear-mongering. One of the things I was very confused about was, what's the problem with having one of these near a church? We're talking about a place that dispenses medicine, Cottage Hospital has a chapel right there. So I don't understand the difference. The difference that I do understand is that people are fear-mongering and that they are alleging things which have no basis in fact. I just want to mention one thing. The city of Seattle had adopted in 2003 their version of Measure P, and after reviewing it, they found that there was no increase in marijuana use among youth or young adults.
Thank you.
Two,
Thank you.
No evident increase in crime.
That's enough.
No adverse impact
Sir.
on public health.
Enough.
That's quite enough.
Joanna LaForce, followed by Jeff Rowland.
Good morning. My name is Joanna LaForce. I've had the opportunity to meet Councilmember White and Hotchkiss this morning and yesterday. I appreciate it. I come to speak with you, as we had talked about, as a member of the Santa Barbara Collectives Alliance. It's an association of current and prospective collective operators in the county of Santa Barbara and its municipalities who have organized around a shared desire to provide safe access to our patients with adherence to a strict code of operational guidelines. We have several goals as far as community involvement, education, and especially to avoid diversion and abuse by our community members and adolescents. We're committed to changing. We've adopted a policy of 21 years of age or older, and many other accreditation and protocols for safe use and access, and to protect the safety and the security of their neighborhoods. As an alliance, we are here to ask you to approve the revised ordinance as is, with a minimum of 7 cap. As I said before, a delay, and I've seen it in other cities that I've talked about before at these meetings, if we delay in regulating, we'll promote an increase in alternative and unethical ways to obtain and sell cannabis. It's been happening. If you pick up the paper, you're seeing multitudes of now people advertising for deliveries. You're going to see much more unregulated use and growth and procurement and sales in residential areas, and it's just opposite of what the neighborhoods want. So we ask that you do that and allow us to move forward with implementation. For your
15
information,
seconds.
REI is a cooperative. So I think we're going to be debating cooperative, collective, according to the Compassionate Use Act, for a long time. So to stay as a moratorium or ban, we're just going to be prolonging this revised ordinance. It's just setting us up for more problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LaForce. Jeff Rowland, followed by Sefton Graham.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Mr. White and Mr. Hotchkiss, and good to see you again, Mr. House. Here we are again. I guess firstly I'd just like to say that I'm very much in favor of the Planning Commission's recommendations, and that would be to severely limit the number of dispensaries. I think 7 is clearly way too many, and a number more like 2 or 3 is probably appropriate. I sent an email letter to you guys late last week with an attached spreadsheet. I hope you actually did look at it. I spent a lot of time doing research in the state of California in terms of cities that do regulate, based on both our population numbers here as well as our land size, and that's census data. We should have about 3 if you want to be in line with all the other cities in California. So 7's more than twice that number. I'm also fully in agreement with the recommendation, and I believe where this all started, right, was where you guys were supposed to come up with an ordinance that was sort of in line with the adult entertainment ordinance. Doesn't seem to be what's happened at all. So it seems like if we want to protect people from, a dirty picture, something that all humans do all the time, some more or less than others, that we would want to at least have that same level of protection from marijuana, which, I used it when I was younger. I don't happen to use it anymore. I voted for Proposition 215 as a first step towards legalization. But it's clear that, potential exposure to what is still actually a federally illegal substance, children, people who are at risk of relapsing into drug problems, we should restrict that, I think, a little bit more strictly. Last thing is the moratorium or the amortization period. I would strongly recommend that whatever Mr. Wiley says is the most restrictive amortization period that the city can get away with without getting into trouble should probably be adopted. Last and not least, the argument that this is going to drive this stuff into people's backyards is just, number one, it's silly. I mean, you can buy beer in the store. How many people brew it in their homes? Not very many. And And the Proposition 215, people are
Wrap up.
supposed to be doing it in their backyards. They're not supposed to be stores. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rowland. Sefton Graham to be followed by Bonnie Raisin.
Chair White, Sefton Graham, I'm the director of the Green Light. We're one of those stores that he was talking about that we're not supposed to be a store. We are a collective. We're organized as a nonprofit. And I was hoping to get clarification. If the new revisions are adopted, would that negate the 3 new dispensaries that have been permitted, including us? Is that, I guess maybe we could ask the staff to clarify, would that?
Okay, what I'd like to do is to gather, we have the non-conforming issue. We'll deal with then the negating of your permit as part of our, when staff wraps up at the end. So ask your questions, and then we're going to answer them as a bunch when we're done.
We started the process in 2008, and it's taken us till now to get a building permit.
Right.
We're just about ready to open. We're getting our final inspections. And so I'm just curious if, as it's written, it seems that we've been written out of it. And with the 1,000 feet rule, it seems that the 2 that have just been approved on Milpas would be negating each other. And it seems odd that we would make it so that the people who have just gone through the new ordinance would no longer be there.
Right.
In addition to getting rid of the ones that are non-conforming, it seems like there would be no access for the moratorium period, which is interesting.
Well, I think we got your question, and we will deal with it. So stay with us.
Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Raisin. Hello, and welcome to the Ordinance Committee.
Thank you.
The gentleman, 2 gentlemen ago, spoke pretty much about my feelings regarding the number of collectives. I would prefer that it be handled in a different way. But if we have to have them at all, I would certainly hope that we wouldn't have more than 4. That was a former member of the Ordinance Committee tried hard for that, and I feel that way too. Also, I don't believe that there is a complete picture of where the sober living homes exist. I'm concerned that with real estate being as fluctuating as it is, and it changes, that a daycare center or a sober living house might want to open up and be unable to or not want to because of an existing collective. I think that has to be looked at, and I don't know just how you're going to do it. The 2 people who spoke, that is the Patients Group and the Compassionate Center, sound like they are operating within strict guidelines. And if those 2 exist, and then we have 2 on Milpas Street that are operating in the same way, I don't know, pass-through doors, cards, and all of that, then that's 4.
30 seconds.
Okay. So I'm concerned, sober living houses, daycare centers that might want to start up, we need them. Marijuana is a gateway drug. I will die saying that. I think it's a risky business to have it available to students. And also, I guess a police ordinance isn't possible, but it sounds like a good idea. And definitely they should be registered. So I don't know if I've been clear, but I'm hoping that you will take the other side, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Raisin. Tim Cooney to be followed by Dr. David Behrman.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you on the time and effort that you put into this matter. I know it's been a lot of work and a lot of time put in for the past few years. My name is Tim Cooney. I currently have an application in at 302 East Haley. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara. Currently raising my family in town. We started working well over a year ago on our current project, and we finally finished our rigorous application process that is currently required by the city. Unfortunately, due to illness, I was unable to make our public hearing, and fortunately our application at the time was approved, and we continued moving forward. We have spent countless hours and resources on this project, and we are currently paying rent at our approved site. Our current project meets and exceeds all current and proposed ordinances. And I agree with the council's efforts to regulate and put restrictions on both the opening and operation of cooperatives in town. I just hope that the adoption of the ordinance may be conducted in as timely manner as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney. Thank you for being timely, too. Dave Behrman, followed by Nathaniel Reinke.
Members of the Ordinance Committee, I'm Dr. David Bierman. I'm a practicing physician here in Santa Barbara. I've been here for 40 years. I've been involved in drug abuse treatment and prevention for longer than that time. I've worked at all levels of government. I am the vice president of the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine, and I find cannabis is useful in treating many of my patients. And you must bear in mind the people with Parkinson's disease, the people with multiple sclerosis, the people who have quadriplegia, the people who have paraplegia. For these people, there really is no other practical choice than a dispensary, which, of course, the Supreme Court has not ruled on and is most likely legal, according to the Attorney General. The kinds of people that I see, you need to keep upmost in your mind. My key points I've made over and over again. Sandra Day O'Connor was right. The states have the constitutional authority to regulate medicine. You shouldn't have to be dealing with this. Medicine should be dispensed by nurses and pharmacists. My father was a pharmacist. He dispensed cannabis from 1928 to 1941. Nobody raised an eyebrow. No one under 25 should work behind the counter. Cannabis is a medicine. Who says so? The American Public Health Association, the American Nurses Association, the American College of Physicians, the American Medical Association, and 14 states in the United States. Oakland and West Hollywood have dispensary models that work pretty well. We need to set up a healing environment. This is about the patients. Dispensaries should be easily accessible and user-friendly. They should be able to serve people from a wide variety of ages and cultural backgrounds. It seems to me that there's been a lot of misinformation here. For instance, the Institute of Medicine, in a report that was paid for by the United States government, said that cannabis was not a gateway drug. I implore you to take a look at the intent of this legislation, which is to serve the ill.
Your time is up. Thanks.
I make it within 2 minutes?
No, almost. Nathaniel Reinke, followed by Hans Edwards.
Chair White, council members House and Hotchkiss, thanks for letting me speak. Want to make sure that you don't punish those of us that have followed the rules and gone through the city process and done things the right way. Also, the state is fine with storefronts. The Board of Equalization has no problem having us collect and remit sales tax to them. And also, if you limit the numbers of collectives in town, you'll end up with big box stores. Santa Barbara's not a big box town. You don't want to make that. And please don't prevent safe access for the patients. Thank you.
Thank you. Hans Edwards.
Honorable members of the committee. I represent the applicants of 2 West Mission Street, and this application is disallowed at this moment or revoked. We are seeking another location in the Mission area. We believe the Mission area is an important area to have a dispensary. However, it is an extremely small area, and we want to find a different location for our dispensary because we do not want to challenge the school or have any problem with the school. since it is such a small area, and we have seen the council propose in the past changes in the areas, I would like to suggest a small change that could be made with the southern border of this area, which is Arriaga Street, if I'm not mistaken. If it were dropped 2 blocks to La Sola, this would add basically a block and a half of commercial space on Chapala to that area. That's all it would really do. But it would be helpful because it's very difficult to find space in the first place.
30
and
seconds.
The area being small, all the more so. This would be important because there's a concentration. You don't want to have a concentration of dispensaries in other areas, and I think Mission is a good area to have one. And for that reason, I respectfully propose this change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. That concludes our public testimony. Do we have anybody else who wants to speak, since it's clear we're not going to get done with this today? And I encourage you in the future to submit written, as Mr. Vassallo did, and thank you for it, submit written comments, and several of you that met with me as well. It does help us, particularly as in the situation which is likely today, where we're going to be continuing this. All right, so we have 2 big questions from public, asked by the public, having to do with the nonconformity. And Mr. Cotto is going to remember the other one. What's going to happen with the one that's been approved? I believe it's on Olive Street, and how are they going to be affected by the proposed ordinance?
Mr. Chair, could I jump in and suggest, at least from my perspective, I would suggest that the Ordinance Committee consider not making distinctions between when an existing dispensary became nonconforming. In other words, we apparently have some dispensaries that opened even prior to the original March of 2008 ordinance, and they were treated as legal nonconforming because they opened at a time when we didn't have any regulations. Then we had some that have been permitted and have opened under the existing ordinance, the March 2008 ordinance, which would include this one on Garden Street. Although they haven't opened yet, apparently, they have pulled a building permit. And generally, pulling a building permit is considered sort of vesting of your discretionary planning approvals. So we're treating them as if they're open. If I'm following this correctly, I think we're talking about 4 dispensaries. There were originally 4 that opened prior to any city ordinance. 3 of those, according to what we've been advised, suspended their operation, stopped operating for more than 30 days, so they lost their nonconforming status. So I believe we only have 1 left of those, and that's, if I'm not mistaken, the one at 3128 State Street, which I believe they acknowledge that they don't satisfy the locational requirements under this ordinance now. And that leaves then 2 on Milpas that were properly permitted under the city's ordinance, and a 3rd one for a total of 4 on Garden Street that hasn't quite opened yet. I think we should just look at those 4, treat them as legal nonconforming, and decide what we want to do from here on out. Do we want to impose a 6-month amortization period on them? In other words, do we want to say to them, you either have to move to a location that satisfies the new ordinances, the ordinance that would be adopted, or somehow legalize your existing location? Some of them, the Milpas ones, may end up being legal. Garden may end up being legal. And as long as they're complying with the operational requirements of our ordinance, there may not be an issue. So anyway, my main point is I don't think we should make distinctions as to when a dispensary became legal, how it was permitted. Just deal with it prospectively under the new regulations that the Ordinance Committee feels are appropriate and that ultimately the Council feels is appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. So questions from, well, first of all, let's go back to staff and those. Is there any other comments you want to make besides what Mr. Wiley made on responding to the public at this point? Okay. So then, Mr. House?
Well, I think we need to resolve a little bit of that still, because there are 3 that are have been permitted on the east side, and we had discussed that the way this would play out would be that over some period of time, and by attrition, you would expect that one or another might go out of business, and at that point, eventually you would end up with perhaps one in that area, but that would be then that would be the one for that area. And that's how we discussed it before at Ordinance. Now, I'm just maybe reporting back on that. And that when this set of revisions goes into effect, it wouldn't suddenly make us have to take a lottery or something of who's the one left or something, or go through any other process. It would be an attrition. That's I feel pretty solid in that recollection, Mr. Cato.
Chair White, yes, that's my recollection as well.
And then I think we had another situation that I had asked you about, Mr. Wiley, at the City Council meeting when we discussed this. And it was just a general proposition, but it was, I know there's some concern about at least one of the existing dispensaries has been around for many years that had they contend, and I think rather forcefully, that they were in business during the entire 30 days that was in dispute. And I know that your office is looking very hard at that to see if that's really true. But if it were to be found that they were continuously in existence, even if not, anyway, if there were, then they would be one of those that would be considered in that larger group you just talked about, the non-conforming, legal non-conforming. Now, they would still have to, and again, to be really clear, everyone who is in that group would still have to come up to the requirements of our the new revisions of the ordinance, and we were talking about 6 months as the period of time in which they would have to do that. Now, am I on the right track there, Mr. Wiley?
Councilmember House, that's correct. Just on that last point, our ordinance, even the March 2008 ordinance, always said, even if you are legal nonconforming as to your location, you've got to immediately comply with the operational restrictions. So, despite that a legal nonconforming dispensary might be within 500 feet of a park, they still had to have the security requirements, the operational requirements. And so it was really only the locational things that were non-conforming. So that's in the ordinance. I assume it'll continue in the ordinance. And you make a good point about the 3 that are in essentially code enforcement cases right now, because the information we have is that they shut down for more than 30 days. It may be that ultimately when those cases go to trial in Superior Court, which is really kind of where they're headed, the judge says, no, the evidence is insufficient for the judge to conclude that they shut down, and would tell us that they have to be allowed to remain legal nonconforming. That's possible. So I think we have to keep that in mind.
Okay, very good. I had a question for you, Mr. White, because you were on the Planning Commission when this was last heard, and I had heard a couple of things that I know we've discussed before. One of them had to do, and it seemed like there was a fairly strong consensus on the basis of the Planning Commission around at least these 2 points. There were lots of different comments, but these 2. One of them had to do with the appealing to the City Council. I know that's been a big issue. And the other one had to do with the area in the medically zoned area, actually, but the area around Cottage Hospital where there's lots of medical offices and like that. And I know we have to make maybe some special arrangements, because if somebody were to locate there, they'd be probably in an office somewhere, not in necessarily a storefront. So I know that our staff is considering that. My question is, am I correct in saying that there seemed to be a consensus about that, and also to send a signal that those are things that would be of interest to me in our discussion?
Well, thank you. And yes, on both points. Number one, on the Cottage Hospital question, or Cottage Hospital area question, it seemed to me, and I think in my recollection, I didn't go back and look at the minutes to see whether there was any disagreement, but I think that my recollection is that everybody on the commission thought that it was logical to have a dispensary within basically as part of the medical community there. So so that absolutely on that point, and I wanted to ask questions in that regard, is because I'm understanding the zoning is an issue. There may be an issue around the zoning on that, but and also the distances from rehab centers. There's a new house 2 is right in the middle of everything there, and there may be others as well that are so that there's that location question which comes to mind, which I'll also speak to, at least from my own recollection. And secondly, on the appeal issue, it was during my time on Planning Commission, it was the only item that I recalled coping with, which the appeal ended up at Planning Commission, and that was the end stop when it fell to me, and I think it fell to everybody, that this is a hot issue, this is obviously controversial for the community, and then therefore the citizens ought to have the right to be taking their concerns to their elected officials, rather than it ending at a body which is one step removed from the electorate. So that was the basic concern.
Okay, I'll just, these are not concluding remarks, but I just want to say I really do hope that today we can make some headway. I would very much like to see us get back to City Council as soon as possible. I think we've done a lot of work, and I don't want to get too nitpicky on it if we can possibly help it, because we've really gotten pretty far along.
Well, we've got, even if I were to stretch it 5 minutes, we've got 17 minutes. So at this point, unless staff has other comments at this point, do you have questions, Frank? Mr. Hotchkiss, excuse me.
Yeah, I do. Mr. Cotto brought up a good point. If you use these perimeters of 500 or 1,000 feet and observe them, then what happens if suddenly a school wants to open up down the block? Are we going to say, oh, no, school can't open up there? Or is his solution of corridors, I guess is the way I would put it, designated blocks, resolve a lot of those problems potentially?
And Councilmember Hotchkiss, I believe that the solution of focusing on block faces is a much cleaner approach, is a much more understandable approach. And this dispute over the application on West Mission is a good example. We thought we knew where all the schools were, and now, for example, people are suggesting that we include any kind of care center or shelter.
Right.
And I'll tell you, those terms are not defined in such a way that we really know where they are.
Right.
So I believe the block face approach is actually better. We would obviously run any block face through these radius things and see, well, how close are they to a school and a park and a shelter. To answer your other question, the way we typically do this, and I think it's really the only way that it really works, is to take a snapshot period. When someone comes in and applies for a dispensary, if we have a radius requirement, we check it then and there, and at that point, if it qualifies, it does. And if a school comes in later or something else comes in later, it doesn't change the fact that they qualified when they were permitted.
Okay. Another question. Mr. Cotto, the staff recommended 7 approvals. Do you know where those would be?
Chair White, Councilmember Hotchkiss, well, it's not really a staff recommendation. It's a carrying forward of the Ordinance Committee's recommendations, first of all. But those locations are, let me go back down here. They would be in the outer State Street area, which is this area bounded by, this is how we've done it so far, at the direction of the Ordinance Committee. This area bounded by the green line would be outer State Street. It ends about Kyle Morales or so.
Right, and there are two there now, correct?
There are, yes, that's right. 3128 State Street and then 3516 State are the two that are in this area now. They're both non-conforming.
Okay.
The next one, the way we split it up was to be the De La Vina area, starts at Kyler House and goes down to either Alomar or Constance. There, and there's one illegal one there now.
Right.
The next one is the Mission area, which again, it's kind of, this is Mission, Delavina, Chapala, State Street down to about Arriaga Street.
Okay.
The next one would be downtown east and west, and downtown west is surrounded by this box here, and would go from about the freeway to about a little bit past Santa Barbara Street. And then east would go from Santa Barbara Street to a couple blocks to this side of Milpas. I think that's...
Right, and you've got a proposed one on Chapala there, correct?
Correct. There's a proposed one on Chapala. Now that proposed one, actually there's two proposed on Chapala. One in the Paseo Chapala building, which so far the way the ordinance is written, that would be precluded because it's in an existing mixed-use building. And then a second one at the corner of Chapala and Haley. And then, and then on the east side, 631 Olive is there, 302 East
That's pretty
Haley
close
is
to
there.
Transition House. Do we care?
Well, I guess it depends on who you are, whether you care or not.
I'm just trying to figure out what the guidelines are.
Right.
here,
From the ordinance, the current ordinance perspective, there's no restriction on items like transition house, existing ordinance. This is why it was approved. Whether the council wants to add a protected use like transition house or affordable housing or daycares, that's a question that's still out there.
Okay, and Anacapa's in that same area, the one on Anacapa.
Yes, the one on Anacapa is down here. That's non-conforming. That's at Anacapa and Haley. That's one of the ones that would have to close. Under
Is
the
it about
current
to close
ordinance.
that?
Well, it would have to close under the current ordinance.
Okay.
And then the next is Milpas. There are two on Milpas, one at 331 and one at 500. And then the lastly, Mesa, nothing up on the Mesa yet.
Well, it looks like 8 to me, from just doing a tally here. Okay.
I don't think so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Hey, you come up with 7? All right, maybe I was inexact. All right, thank you. Yeah, you got 2 on Chapala there. So.
Sorry. Were you counting dispensaries? I was counting the geographic areas. Yeah, no, the dispensaries, there's quite a bit more than 7, actually.
Yeah. So at what point, how do we determine who, if you came up with 7 in those 7 areas, how would one make the determination, you stay, you go?
Well, there are 2 things we have to think about. The ones that already exist, like on Milpas, there's 2 that exist and are permitted.
Right.
So what the previous ordinance committee had thought was they just get to stay until one of them closes or both of them close.
Right.
So that's one way to handle the existing ones that are permitted. If you're talking about prospective ones that haven't come in yet, what we've been doing so far is we've said if there are 2 in proximity to each other within 500 feet, then whoever gets deemed complete first, whoever has the best and most complete application first, gets to have their chance to get approved first. If they get approved, then the other one that was later they don't have a chance. They're done. But if the one who's deemed complete first somehow doesn't get approved, then the second one gets to go forward. That's how we've been handling it. We could handle it a different way. Whoever puts their application in first gets to go first.
That sounds just. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, well, it's to the committee, and I appreciate comments at this point. Mr. House?
Hey, I'm going to go down outstanding issues in the staff report. And
that would be good to get the staff list up there of things that you want us to consider then.
Okay, and number 1 in the list has the number of dispensaries and number of geographic areas. And I want to say I am intrigued by the Planning Commission's suggestion of the Cottage Hospital area. It tends to seem plausible. I don't know if it needs to hold up this process. The 7 that we've identified are logical, and if you take those circles, it restricts it down to very specific, basically addresses, which is a little distinct from saying a big zone or something. And I like this approach better. I think we're on the right track. So I would say certainly adding back in that 16 and 38 La Cumbra to get really specific about it. That was something I really rather thought that we had done already, but that was my mistake, I suppose. The terracotta areas that you had identified, they also were very logical, and they made sense. They were in the same particular zone, so I feel comfortable with those. So, but then that gives us some defined areas. So the wild card in that is just the Cottage Hospital area, and I don't know what the parameters perimeter that might be. And I think that perhaps if this group were interested in that, it could come to council with a map that you put together for council to consider.
Can I respond?
Pato?
Chair White, Councilmember House, the area that I was thinking of for the cottage hospital would be the area that around that zone CO, the medical office zone, and it extends for about a block or a block and a half from the cottage hospital area itself. There's not going to be
pretty narrow. We worked on it before when we dealt with that particular zone.
Yeah, correct. It's not a very big area. If the ordinance committee wanted to give that direction to go that way, we'd also have to put in some sort of language about the storefronts. Right now it's required to be in a storefront, but most of these are offices. They could be second floor offices, and if the ordinance committee wanted to give us that direction, we'd work with the police department to figure out some way to make that work.
Or it could even happen as a revision of the revision at a follow-up time. Let me just go ahead and take the next piece here. The appeal process, I believe that there is merit. Watching the Planning Commission on 2 occasions wrestle with these things, the City Council is an appeal. I can go along with that and would encourage that. The amortization period, my concern with this has to do, this is with regards to existing non-conforming, and it has a lot to do with how timely our process is for this revision. If for some reason it were to stretch out for, instead of coming back to council in another couple of weeks and then getting approved at the end of February, early part of March, if it were to be like a 6 or 7 month long process, then a 6-month amortization period would put them would be impossible. I mean, I'm concerned about that. So that's just a concern I have. Right now we have let's see, am I correct? We have it would be April of 2011 under the current ordinance that the legal or the non-conforming ones would have to comply, right? Okay. It really has to do with how long we see this process going. If we're going to have phase 1 revisions, come back to City Council in a timely fashion, we're going to bring it back for approval or up or down, whatever, in the next couple months, then I think that the 6-month makes sense. But if we're going to try to do something like get all this phase 2 figured out, that's going to take months and months and months. And I don't see how we could possibly hold them to 6 months. On the amortization period for approved and permitted dispensaries to become conforming due to the revisions, I say okay to what we have here with the 6 months. And then I mentioned Cottage Hospital already and the other locations. And then the next steps, for me, it's really clear. And I read the revised ordinance language, or some of the very last words in here make it very clear, because we have to comply with state law on this too. And that is that once we come up with the revised ordinance, for which we've got this moratorium until we can come up with it, that then the suspension should fall off. And for me, that should be when the phase 1 revisions are done, and then we can get into this other stuff. But the phase 1 revisions is what would be the effective moment at which whatever suspension we come up with this afternoon would end. And I think we need to really say that out loud at this point so it's clear. The way the revised ordinance is written, it is that way. And I was checking with Mr. Wiley about that before this hearing to really be sure about it. But we've got the language at the very end. Let's see if I can find it. Anyway, it's in here. And we can go over that if we need to.
So I didn't understand exactly what you said in that last little bit there, Mr. House.
Here's
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes, there's a state law that requires, if we do have moratorium, like we have done, a suspension of this kind of a process, that we have to identify when it will end. And what it's tied to is the improvement or the revision of the ordinance that was being suspended. Right. The language in here is very clear about it, and that is as soon as we come up with this revision and City Council has approved it, the suspension is over. Okay, so if I read this next step 6 item here, we've got a few different ways to play this. I would like us to take phase 1 back to City Council after we're done with it today or maybe next time, whatever, but get it back to City Council as soon as we can and have them as a whole say up or down or whatever they do, and then at that point the suspension will terminate. The other option would be for us to decide to try to do all of Phase 1 and Phase 2 and wrangle with that stuff for literally, I believe it will take months to do that. And I'm not for that. I think that would be a disservice to the community. So I just want to be very, very clear about that. And I think that addressed all the things that we had here that staff had given us to consider.
Thank you, Mr. House. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Well, I'm pretty much in agreement with Mr. House. I frankly like the staff recommendations with the addition or the change of the blocks that Mr. Wiley was talking about. And, you know, for people with a real need, a medical need for this, it's important. I'm not dead sure that we have to relocate someplace up at Cottage Hospital. People seem to be getting where they need to go right now. And so if that's going to hold things up, I'd sort of pass on that. But what else can I say? You know, I think if I read that right, the people are concerned here and elsewhere about these dispensaries at all. It's because of young kids and, you know, people using this in a recreational way. And, you know, unfortunately, I don't think there's any way that even if we shut down every dispensary that would ever go away, honestly. And attacking that problem is not going to occur here, I don't believe. So I think that to some degree just saying, oh, no, we're not going to have dispensaries at all wouldn't work. It wouldn't do what we want. It would look good on paper maybe, but it wouldn't accomplish what we want. So, I mean, I want to move this forward.
Thank you. My overview is that I think we should have the minimum number of dispensaries that would provide the medical need while maintaining some price competition. And I see that to be 3 or 4, something in that range. I think with that small number, that therefore there would need to be more leeway given on the non-conforming dispensaries. Give them a little more time to salvage their business. Mr. Edwards, I believe his name is, had talked about the Mission Street area. I'm wondering whether this Cottage Hospital isn't that far from Mission Street. Would there be a way to go uphill rather than down to provide an area that's it just makes sense to me that someone who's coming from their doctor visit would be able to stop by and pick up their medication. It makes sense to me. On the appeal, I obviously feel that the appeal should go forward to council. And then the business of locations and all the circles and clouds and parks and rehab facilities. I found myself at Planning Commission feeling as if we are micromanaging this in a way that is not necessarily useful. I feel like there are going to be good areas for it. I look at the Upper State Street area. I sort of went to my local knowledge rather than sort of trying to come up with criteria that would work. And I see that Upper State Street, the La Cumbre, the West La Cumbre spot. I'm imagining that's a target because has potential. As I mentioned, the hospital. I think that the Milpa Street area has the fact that I think we have seen the most professional application, again, at Planning Commission. I didn't support that application for certain reasons, which I won't go into here, but that feels, again, it's on the east side. It's convenient to that population. I don't see the downtown as being, it's difficult to park. I don't see it as being convenient for someone who's trying to pick up medication, so that doesn't, for me, I don't need one in the Civic Center. So those are my thoughts on the broad outline of my sort of my policy base going forward with this effort. And Mr. House,
there's only one point at which you and I are not agreeing here, and that has to do with the number of the locations. And I just want to be cognizant that the number of areas in town doesn't mean that that's the number of dispensaries. I mean, I think it's going to be very hard for somebody to locate one on the Mesa, for instance. I just happen to know the rental environment up there. But in any case, let me just give a stab at this and see what happens. I move that we, at the Ordinance Committee, that we send this to the City Council with the following recommendations. That the City Council be, that the appeal process into the City Council. That we, I was going to say, that we actually don't change with the staff recommendation, the 6 months, we'll keep with the 6 months on the non-conforming dispensaries and the approved and permitted. Stay with staff recommendation on that, as Mr. Hotchkiss was saying. The allowable locations, as I had outlined a moment ago, which included the ones at La Cumbra, on La Cumbra, they included Terracotta on your maps, Mr. Cato. And one thing I did not mention, I will be interested to hear if the others would agree, and I'm not sure exactly how it fits, but forgot his last name, Mr. Edwards, had suggested some of the commercial property that was in the De La Vina, well, what we're calling the Mission area, but it's more towards Arriaga and Sola. And I would like you to, as part of this motion, to explore with him what he's talking about, and perhaps bring that to City Council for us to consider. The same thing is true with the Cottage Hospital area. I don't think we can resolve them right here, but I think that in the motion I'd like to request that you bring those maps so the City Council can take a look at those to see if they would go along with that. That we stop right now with the Phase 1 revisions and not try to morph right into Phase 2, but we bring them to City Council for approval, and that be considered if they are approved, then that's when the suspension would be lifted. Yes, sir.
Chair White, did I hear a maximum number?
I haven't got there yet.
Oh, sorry.
I waited till the end just because I wanted Mr. White to feel really good before I said it. And the last thing, I shared before one of the concerns that we really chewed over here before, and I just be the memory for the group, was that concentrating in a particular neighborhood or another in town, the kind of intensity that might come with such a few number, that really gave rise to this number 7. It had to do with really looking at the map from the sky and seeing how you would geographically distribute it. And then think of your grandmother going over to the dispensary to take care of her lumbago or whatever she's got. So that was the concern. So I'm staying with 7 in the motion, and we'll just give that to council to consider. That's the end of it. I think, did I cover all the territory, Mr.
Okay. We need. So, is there a second?
There is a second.
Okay. There's a motion and a second for the proposal as outlined by Mr. House. I have a question about the non-conforming and the amortization period. I was getting number one that April 11 was one date, and then I was hearing 6 months, and I don't understand how one relates to the other.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, the existing ordinance is on the books now. The March 2008 ordinance provides that any dispensary that opened prior to the effective date of that ordinance had to comply or shut down within 3 years, and that would be March of 2011.
Okay.
That's on the books now. This is revising that ordinance, and so the council can do whatever they want to do, and the proposal has been that instead the existing non-conforming dispensaries would comply or shut down within 6 months of the effective date of these amendments. Okay. So if we introduce and adopt these in February, they would roughly have to shut down by August or comply, whichever would apply.
And Mr. Chair, I had meant to include that as part of my motion. Just again, we're recommending this to City Council. We're not settling it today, but the recommendation is exactly what Mr. Wiley said. From the effective date of the revisions, that 6-month clock would begin ticking. Yes, sir.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
I wanted
did you
to
have some-
quiz some of the,
Excuse me, Mr. Hotchkiss.
yeah.
I just want to clarify on the amortization period. For those permitted dispensaries, the one that went through our process, they get to stay and leave by attrition, right?
Yes.
Is that part of your motion?
Well, I didn't think we needed to say that because that was, but I'd be glad to.
Yeah, I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss?
I just want to ask the public, is the 6-month period...
Don't ask the public, you know. You know.
Mr. Edwards, thank you.
Don't do
Is
that.
the 6-month period a... No?
Yeah.
Sorry, forget it.
Okay. All right. So there's a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. And I just don't see any more than I could be pushed to 4 and be more comfortable with 3. Thank you. All right. Well, the Ordinance Committee is now adjourned. And thank you all for your input and your effort on this difficult issue.